The crack of thunder split the summer sky over Fort McDowell, Arizona, and that was when Dalton Vance first noticed the way Eleanor Easton's whole body went rigid as stone, her fingers gripping the porch railing so tight her knuckles turned white as bleached bone in the harsh June sunlight of 1878. He had been leading his dapple mare past the general store, dust from the trail still coating his boots and the brim of his hat, when the storm rolled in fast over the Superstition Mountains like it owned the desert. The first rumble was distant, a warning growl from nature itself, but when the second crack came louder and closer, he saw her actually jump, a full flinch that made her drop the basket she had been carrying. Apples rolled across the wooden planks, tumbling down the steps into the dirt street, but she did not move to collect them. She just stood there, frozen, her chest rising and falling too fast, her dark eyes wide with something that looked like pure terror. Dalton did not know her name yet, did not know anything about her, except that she had arrived in Fort McDowell 3 weeks prior on the stage from Prescott, and that she had taken up residence in the room above the seamstress shop, where she worked mending clothes and sewing dresses for the few women in town who could afford such luxuries. He had seen her in passing, noticed the way she kept her head down and her voice quiet, the way she seemed to make herself small in a world that was already trying to crush people into dust. But now, watching her stand there trembling as another roll of thunder moved across the sky, something in his chest tightened. He wrapped his mare's reins around the hitching post and crossed the street in long strides, his spurs jingling with each step. The first fat drops of rain were starting to fall, leaving dark circles in the pale dirt. "Madam," he said, keeping his voice low and steady as he approached the porch. "You all right there?" She turned to look at him, and he could see the effort it took for her to focus on his face instead of the darkening clouds overhead. Her lips parted, but no words came out at first. Another crack of thunder, closer now, and she flinched again, her whole body jerking. Without thinking about it, without asking permission or wondering if it was proper, Dalton climbed the 3 steps to the porch and held out his hand to her. "Storm's coming in hard," he said. "Let me help you inside." Eleanor stared at his outstretched hand like it was a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. The rain was falling harder now, big drops that drummed against the roof and kicked up tiny explosions of dust in the street. Her breathing was still too fast, shallow and panicked, and when the next boom of thunder rolled overhead, she reached out and grabbed his hand with both of hers. Her grip was desperate, strong enough that he could feel her fingernails digging into his palm through the calluses. He closed his fingers around hers, solid and sure, and felt her whole body lean toward that connection like a tree bending toward water. "I have got you," he said quietly. "It is just noise, cannot hurt you." "I know," she whispered, but her voice shook. "I know that, I do, but I cannot seem to make myself believe it." The rain was a downpour now, turning the street into a river of mud. Lightning flashed bright enough to make shadows jump, and the thunder that followed was immediate and deafening. Eleanor made a small sound in the back of her throat, and Dalton shifted his position so he was standing between her and the storm, blocking her view of the violent sky. "Look at me," he said, and when she did, he saw that her eyes were the color of rich earth after rain, dark and deep. "Just keep looking right here. Do not look at the sky. Look at me." She nodded, her fingers still wrapped tight around his hand. They stood like that for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 10 minutes, the storm raging around them, while he held her hand and kept his eyes locked on hers. He told her about his ranch, about the cattle he was running in the foothills, about the creek that ran clear and cold even in the height of summer. He told her about his horse, about the mountain lion he had seen last week sunning itself on a boulder, about the way the sunset turned the rocks red and gold. He just kept talking, his voice steady and low, until finally the thunder started to move east and the rain began to ease. When the storm had passed far enough that only distant rumbles remained, Eleanor seemed to come back to herself. She looked down at their joined hands and color flooded her cheeks. "I am so sorry," she said, starting to pull away. "I did not mean to—" But Dalton did not let go. "No need to apologize," he said. "I am Dalton Vance. I have got a ranch about 5 miles north of here. Eleanor Easton," she said quietly. "I work for Mrs. Patterson, the seamstress. Pleased to make your acquaintance, Miss Easton." He finally released her hand, but slowly, like he was reluctant to break the connection. "Though I wish it had been under calmer circumstances. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "So do I, Mr. Vance." He bent down and started collecting the apples that had fallen from her basket, wiping the dirt off on his shirt before placing them carefully back in the woven container. When he straightened and handed it to her, their fingers brushed again, and he saw her eyes flicker down to where they touched. "Thank you," she said, "for helping me, for not thinking I am ridiculous." "Do not think that at all," Dalton said honestly. "We have all got something that scares us. Yours just happens to be storms." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. "Most people think fear is weakness. Most people are fools." He touched the brim of his hat. "I should let you get inside and dry off. But, Miss Easton, if you do not mind my asking, would it be all right if I called on you sometime? Maybe took you to dinner at the hotel?" She blinked, surprise clear on her face. "You want to call on me?" "I would like that very much, yes." Another rumble of thunder, far away now, and he saw her tense. Before he could think better of it, he reached out and took her hand again, just held it gently until she relaxed. "Yes," Eleanor said, her voice stronger now. "I would like that too." That was how it started, on a stormy afternoon in Fort McDowell, when the rain turned the desert into something almost green, and Dalton Vance discovered that the thing he wanted most in the world was to be the shelter Eleanor Easton ran to when the sky turned dark. Over the next few weeks, Dalton found himself making excuses to come to town more often than was strictly necessary. He needed supplies from the general store, or he had business at the bank, or he was checking on a saddle repair that was not actually ready yet. Every time, he would find his way to the seamstress shop, and every time, Eleanor would look up from her sewing with those dark eyes and smile at him like he had brought sunshine into the room. They took that dinner at the hotel, sitting across from each other at a small table, while the owner's wife served them beef stew and fresh bread. Eleanor told him about growing up in Missouri, about her parents dying of fever when she was 16, about living with her aunt and uncle who had not been kind. She told him about saving every penny she could earn from sewing until she had enough for a ticket west, about choosing Fort McDowell because it was far away from everything she had known and she wanted to start fresh. Dalton told her about his father dying in the war, about his mother following a year later from grief, about building his ranch from nothing with his own 2 hands and the money from selling the family farm in Texas. He told her about the loneliness of the life, about going days without seeing another soul, about coming to town and feeling like he did not quite fit anywhere. "I know that feeling," Eleanor said quietly, "like you are always on the outside looking in." "Not anymore," Dalton said, and reached across the table to take her hand. "Not when I am with you." She turned her hand over in his, lacing their fingers together. "I feel that too." They courted properly, the way things were supposed to be done. Dalton would arrive on Sunday afternoons, and they would walk together along the Verde River, talking about everything and nothing. He learned that she loved reading, but had not been able to afford many books, so he started bringing her volumes from his small collection at the ranch. She learned that he had a weakness for apple pie, so she convinced Mrs. Patterson to teach her how to make one, and presented it to him with shy pride. But it was the storms that truly brought them together. Arizona, in late summer, was a land of monsoons, where the sky would darken in the afternoon and unleash fury on the desert below. The first time it happened while Dalton was visiting, he saw the change come over Eleanor immediately. Her body went tight, her breathing shallow, and her eyes darted to the window where clouds were gathering. He did not say anything, just shifted closer on the settee where they had been sitting in Mrs. Patterson's parlor, and held out his hand. Eleanor took it immediately, gripping tight, and they sat like that through the entire storm. He told her stories about his childhood, about the time he and his brother had tried to catch a wild turkey and ended up covered in mud, about the horse that had thrown him into a water trough in front of the prettiest girl in town. He kept talking until the thunder faded and her grip on his hand loosened. "You do not have to do this every time," she said quietly when it was over. "I know it is a burden." Dalton turned to her, his expression serious. "Eleanor, listening to you breathe is not a burden. Holding your hand is not a burden. If you think for 1 second that I would rather be anywhere else when you need someone, then you do not know me at all." Her eyes filled with tears. "I do not understand why you care so much. We have only known each other a few weeks." "Time does not matter," he said simply. "What matters is that when I am with you, everything makes sense. What matters is that I want to be the one you turn to when you are scared. What matters is that I am falling in love with you, Eleanor Easton, and I do not care if that is too soon or too fast or too anything. It is the truth." She stared at him, tears spilling over onto her cheeks. "I am falling in love with you too," she whispered. "I think I started that very first day, when you held my hand through the storm, like it was the most natural thing in the world." He leaned forward and kissed her then, soft and gentle, tasting salt from her tears. When they pulled apart, she was smiling, really smiling, and he thought he had never seen anything more beautiful in his entire life. The courtship continued through the fall, and Dalton kept his promise. Every single time a storm rolled through, no matter where he was or what he was doing, he would drop everything and go to Eleanor. If he was at the ranch, he would ride into town through rain and lightning, his horse's hooves throwing up mud, just to be there to hold her hand. If he was already in town, he would find her wherever she was and stay with her until the thunder passed. The people of Fort McDowell started to notice. Mrs. Patterson, who had been stern and businesslike at first, began to smile when Dalton showed up at her door. The owner of the general store winked at him when he bought a new shirt to replace the one that got soaked riding through a storm. Even the old men who sat outside the saloon and commented on everything that happened in town nodded approvingly when they saw Dalton and Eleanor walking together. "That Vance boy has got it bad," one of them said loud enough for Dalton to hear as they passed. "Good," another replied. "That Easton girl deserves someone who will take care of her. She has had a hard time of it." Dalton did not know the full story of Eleanor's hard times yet, but he was learning. She told him in pieces, usually late at night, when they sat on Mrs. Patterson's porch and watched the stars come out. She told him about her uncle's drinking, about her aunt's cold silences, about feeling like she was a burden that no one wanted. She told him about the storm that had killed her parents, how they had been caught in a tornado that ripped through their farm, how she had been in the cellar and survived, but they had not. "That is why," she said quietly, "that is why the thunder terrifies me. Because the last time I saw my mother alive, the sky sounded just like that. And then she was gone." Dalton pulled her close, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "I am so sorry," he said. "I cannot imagine losing someone like that." "The worst part is that I know it is not rational," Eleanor continued. "I know that most storms are just storms. They pass and nothing terrible happens. But my body does not seem to understand that. The moment I hear thunder, I am 12 years old again, hiding in the cellar and praying that it will stop." "You do not have to be rational," Dalton said firmly. "You do not have to explain yourself or apologize. You just have to know that I will be here every single time for as long as you need me." Eleanor turned her face into his shoulder. "How did I get so lucky to find you?" "I am the lucky one," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. In November, Dalton asked her to marry him. He did it simply, without fanfare, on a clear evening when the sky was full of stars and the air had finally cooled from the brutal summer heat. They were standing by the river, watching the water flow silver in the moonlight, and he just turned to her and said, "Eleanor, I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to face a storm alone. Will you marry me?" She said yes before he even finished the question, throwing her arms around his neck and kissing him so hard they almost fell into the river. He caught them both, laughing, and spun her around while she held on tight. They were married in the small church in Fort McDowell on a Sunday in December, with Mrs. Patterson standing up as Eleanor's witness and the banker who Dalton did business with standing up as his. Eleanor wore a dress she had made herself, simple but beautiful, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Dalton wore his best suit and could not stop staring at his bride like she was a miracle walking toward him down the aisle. The preacher kept the ceremony short, and when he pronounced them man and wife, Dalton kissed Eleanor like she was the air he needed to breathe. The small congregation clapped, and Mrs. Patterson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, and Dalton thought that this was what happiness felt like, holding the woman he loved and knowing she was his forever. They had a small celebration at the hotel, with cake and dancing and well wishes from the townspeople who had come to care about them both. As the sun set and the party wound down, Dalton helped Eleanor into the wagon he had brought to take them back to the ranch, to the home they would share. The ride out of town was quiet, both of them tired but content. Eleanor leaned against Dalton's shoulder, and he kept one arm around her while he guided the horses with the other. The stars were brilliant overhead, countless points of light in the vast darkness. "Are you nervous?" Dalton asked quietly. Eleanor considered the question. "A little," she admitted. "But mostly I am happy. So happy I feel like I might burst with it." "Good," he said, and kissed the top of her head. "Because I plan on spending every day for the rest of our lives making you even happier." The ranch house was small but well built, with thick adobe walls and a solid roof that kept out the heat in summer and the cold in winter. Dalton had spent the last month fixing it up, making sure everything was perfect for when he brought his bride home. He had whitewashed the walls and built new furniture, had hung curtains that Eleanor had sewn, and placed rugs on the floor to keep out the chill. When he carried her over the threshold, she gasped with delight at what she saw. Candles were lit throughout the main room, casting warm golden light on everything. Flowers that he had ridden 10 miles to buy from a ranch that had a garden were arranged in jars on every surface. A fire burned in the hearth, making the whole place cozy and welcoming. "Dalton," she breathed, "it is beautiful." "You are beautiful," he said, setting her down gently. "The house is just a house. You make it a home." They moved together with an ease that felt natural, like they had been married for years instead of hours. Eleanor explored every room while Dalton banked the fire and locked the door. When he found her in the bedroom, she was standing by the window, looking out at the dark desert beyond. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "I am thinking about how different my life is now," she said softly. "A year ago, I was living in Missouri, miserable and alone, thinking that maybe that was all I deserved. And now I am here, married to the most wonderful man I have ever known, about to start a whole new life." Dalton turned her in his arms so she was facing him. "You deserve everything good in this world," he said seriously. "And I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you get it." She reached up and touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "I love you, Dalton Vance." "I love you too, Eleanor Vance," he grinned. "I like the sound of that. Eleanor Vance." "So do I," she said, and pulled him down into a kiss that started soft and sweet, but quickly became something more. They made their way to the bed, shedding clothes and inhibitions, learning each other's bodies with hands and mouths and whispered words of love. Later, lying tangled together in the darkness with Eleanor's head on his chest and her hair spread across his shoulder, Dalton felt a peace he had never known before. This was what he had been waiting for his whole life. This woman in his arms, this sense of belonging. "Dalton?" Eleanor's voice was sleepy. "Yes, sweetheart?" "Thank you for not giving up on me, for seeing past the fear to who I really am." He tightened his arms around her. "Thank you for trusting me enough to let me in, for loving me even though I am just a rough cowboy who does not have much to offer." "You have everything to offer," she said firmly, lifting her head to look at him. "You have kindness and strength and a heart bigger than this whole desert. You are exactly what I needed, even when I did not know I needed it." He kissed her again, slow and thorough, and then settled her back against his chest. "Sleep now," he murmured. "We have got a whole lifetime ahead of us." The first few months of marriage were an adjustment for them both. Eleanor had to learn the rhythms of ranch life, the early mornings and long days, the constant work required to keep everything running. Dalton had to learn to share his space, to consider someone else's needs and wants, to not be alone anymore. But they worked through it together, with patience and humor and a lot of love. Eleanor learned to cook on the wood stove, though her first attempts at biscuits came out hard as rocks and made Dalton laugh so hard he nearly fell off his chair. Dalton learned to be neater, to not track mud through the house, to actually hang up his coat instead of throwing it over a chair. The storms remained Eleanor's constant struggle. The first one that hit after they were married came in the middle of the night, a late winter tempest that shook the adobe walls and made the windows rattle. Dalton woke to find Eleanor already awake, sitting up in bed with her arms wrapped around herself and her whole body trembling. He did not say anything, just sat up beside her and pulled her into his arms. She came willingly, burying her face against his neck. "I am sorry I woke you," she whispered. "Do not be sorry." He could feel her heart racing against his chest. "I am right here." The thunder boomed, close and loud, and Eleanor flinched hard. Dalton held her tighter, one hand stroking her hair, the other rubbing circles on her back. "Talk to me," he said quietly. Tell me what you are feeling." "Like I cannot breathe," she admitted. "Like the walls are closing in and the sky is falling and everything is going to be taken away." "Look at me, Eleanor." He waited until she lifted her head, until her eyes met his in the darkness. "I am not going anywhere. This house is not going anywhere. You are safe. We are safe. The storm will pass and we will still be right here." She nodded, but he could see she did not quite believe it, so he did what he always did. He kept holding her, kept talking to her, kept being the steady presence she needed until the storm moved on and the thunder faded to nothing. In the morning, exhausted and pale, she apologized again. "I know you need to sleep," she said. "I know you have work to do, and you cannot be staying up all night with me every time it storms." Dalton caught her face in his hands. "Listen to me very carefully," he said. "You are my wife. Taking care of you is not a burden or an inconvenience. It is my honor and my privilege. I do not care if I lose sleep. I do not care if I have to hold you through 100 storms or 1,000. I will do it gladly, every single time, because I love you." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I do not deserve you." "Yes, you do." He wiped the tears away with his thumbs. "You deserve someone who will hold your hand through every storm. And that is exactly what I'm going to do." As winter turned to spring, the storms became more frequent. The monsoon season was approaching, and with it came daily thunderstorms that would roll across the desert like clockwork. Eleanor dreaded it, Dalton could see, even though she tried to hide her fear. One afternoon in late April, when the sky was darkening in the east and the first rumbles of thunder could be heard in the distance, Dalton made a decision. He had been working in the barn, fixing a broken gate, but he put down his tools and headed back to the house. He found Eleanor in the kitchen, her hands stilled on the bread dough she had been kneading, her eyes fixed on the window. She did not seem to hear him come in. "Eleanor," he said gently, and she jumped, turning to face him. "I did not realize you were there," she said, trying to smile. "I was just—" "Come outside with me," he interrupted. She blinked. "Outside? But the storm—" "I know. Come outside anyway." He held out his hand. Eleanor looked at his hand, then at the darkening sky, then back at his face. Whatever she saw there made her wipe her hands on her apron and take his hand without another word. He led her out onto the porch, to the chairs they had placed there for watching the sunset. The wind was picking up, carrying the smell of rain, and lightning flickered in the distance. "Dalton, what are we doing?" Eleanor asked, her voice already tense. "We are going to sit right here and watch the storm," he said calmly, sitting down and pulling her into the chair beside him. "Together." "I cannot do that," she said immediately. "I cannot just sit here and—" "Yes, you can." He took both her hands in his. "Because I am going to be right here with you. I am not asking you to face it alone. I am asking you to face it with me." Eleanor was shaking her head, her breathing already speeding up. "Dalton, please, look at me." He waited until she did. "Do you trust me?" "Yes, of course, but—" "Then trust me now. I will not let anything happen to you. But I think maybe if we face this together, if you can see that the storm passes and we are still here and still safe, maybe it will get a little easier." The thunder was getting closer, and he could see the war happening on her face. Fear versus trust, instinct versus logic. Finally, she nodded, just once, and sat down beside him. Dalton kept hold of one of her hands, lacing their fingers together. With his other hand, he pointed to the horizon where the storm was approaching. "See how the rain looks like a curtain falling from the sky?" he said conversationally. "My pa used to call that the wedding veil of the desert." Eleanor did not answer, but she was looking where he pointed. The thunder rolled again, and she tensed, but she did not run. "And see those clouds?" He pointed to another formation. "The way they are all purple and gray and black? Those are called thunderheads. When I was a kid, I used to think they looked like castles in the sky." The storm was getting closer. The wind picked up more, tossing Eleanor's hair around her face. Lightning split the sky, brilliant white against the dark clouds, and the thunder that followed was loud enough to shake the ground. Eleanor made a small sound and gripped his hand so tight it hurt, but she stayed in her chair. Dalton started talking again, about anything and everything, his voice steady and sure. He talked about the ranch, about the cattle, about the new calf that had been born last week. He talked about wanting to plant fruit trees, about maybe getting some chickens, about the trip to Tucson he wanted to take with her when the summer heat eased. The rain hit suddenly, a wall of water that drummed on the roof and turned the yard into a temporary lake. Lightning flashed again and again, and the thunder was constant, a rolling boom that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Eleanor was trembling violently, tears streaming down her face, but she was still there, still sitting beside him, still holding his hand. Dalton kept talking, kept pointing out things in the storm, kept being her anchor. And then, slowly, the storm began to ease. The lightning moved further away. The thunder became more distant. The rain lightened from a downpour to a steady drum to a gentle patter. The clouds started to break apart, letting through shafts of golden sunlight that turned the rain into glittering diamonds. "Look," Dalton said softly, pointing east. "A rainbow." Eleanor followed his gaze and sucked in a breath. Arching across the sky was a perfect rainbow, brilliant colors against the dark clouds, so vivid it almost did not look real. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "So are you." Dalton turned to look at her. Her face was wet with tears and rain, her hair was a mess, and she looked exhausted. She also looked like the strongest, bravest person he had ever known. "I am so proud of you." Eleanor turned to him, something shifting in her expression. "I did it," she said, like she could not quite believe it. "I sat through the whole storm. I was terrified, but I did it." "You did." He pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "You were so brave, Eleanor." She clung to him, and he felt her start to cry in earnest, big shaking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside. He just held her and let her cry, understanding that this was release, that she needed to let it out. When she finally calmed, she pulled back to look at him. "Thank you," she said simply, "for not letting me run, for making me face it." "We faced it together," he corrected, "and we will keep facing them together, every single one, until they do not scare you anymore. What if they always scare me?" "Then I will hold your hand through every single storm for the rest of our lives," Dalton said, "and I will not mind one bit." Over the next few months, they repeated that ritual every time a storm came through. Dalton would stop whatever he was doing, find Eleanor, and they would sit together and watch the thunder roll across the desert. Sometimes she cried, sometimes she just held his hand so tight her knuckles went white, sometimes she managed to actually talk through the worst of it. But every single time, she faced it instead of hiding from it, and every single time, Dalton was right there beside her. Slowly, gradually, the fear started to lessen. It did not disappear, not entirely, but it became manageable. Eleanor learned to breathe through the panic, learned to remind herself that storms passed and she was safe. And she learned that she did not have to face anything alone, that Dalton would always be there to hold her hand. By the time summer arrived in full force, bringing with it the daily monsoons that were a fact of life in Arizona, Eleanor could sit through most storms without falling apart. She still needed Dalton beside her, still needed to hold his hand and hear his voice, but she could do it. She could face the thunder and know that she would survive it. One evening in late July, after a particularly spectacular storm had blown through and left the desert smelling like rain and sage, they sat together on the porch watching the stars come out. Eleanor had her head on Dalton's shoulder, her hand in his, peaceful and content. "I have been thinking," she said quietly. "About what?" "About how much I have changed since I met you, how different my life is, how different I am." Dalton pressed a kiss to her hair. "You have not changed. You have just become more yourself, the brave, strong woman I knew you were all along." Eleanor lifted her head to look at him. "I want to tell you something. Something I have never told anyone." "You can tell me anything." She took a deep breath. "When I came to Fort McDowell, I was not just running away from my aunt and uncle. I was running away from myself, from my fear. I thought if I came somewhere new, somewhere different, I could leave it all behind and become someone else, someone who was not broken." "You were never broken," Dalton said fiercely, but she shook her head. "Let me finish. I thought I could leave it behind, but of course I could not. The fear came with me. And then you came along, and instead of trying to fix me or change me or make me into someone else, you just loved me exactly as I was. You held my hand through the storms, literally and figuratively, and you never made me feel ashamed or weak. And because of that, because you gave me space to be afraid, but also space to be brave, I found myself again. The person I was before the tornado, before my parents died, before everything fell apart. You gave me back to myself, Dalton. He was looking at her with such love in his eyes that it almost hurt to see. Eleanor, he said, his voice rough with emotion. You gave me back to myself too. Before you, I was just going through the motions, working, surviving, but not really living. You made me want to live again. You made me want to build a future instead of just getting through each day. She cupped his face in her hands. I love you so much. I love you too. He kissed her, slow and sweet, pouring everything he felt into it. When they pulled apart, Eleanor said, I have something else to tell you. What is that? She smiled, the kind of smile that lit up her whole face. I am pregnant. We are going to have a baby. Dalton stared at her for a long moment, the words not quite registering. Then suddenly they did, and he let out a whoop of joy so loud it startled the horses in the barn. He picked Eleanor up and spun her around, laughing, while she held on and laughed with him. A baby, he said, setting her down carefully like she was made of glass. We are going to have a baby. In February, I think, around Valentine's Day. Dalton dropped to his knees in front of her and pressed his face against her stomach, his arms wrapped around her waist. Eleanor ran her fingers through his hair, her smile soft and tender. I am going to be a father, he said, wonder in his voice. You are going to be a wonderful father, Eleanor said, just like you are a wonderful husband. He looked up at her, and she saw tears in his eyes. I am going to take care of you both, he promised. I am going to make sure you have everything you need. I am going to— I know, she interrupted gently. I know you will. I trust you completely. The pregnancy was not easy. Eleanor was sick for the first 3 months, barely able to keep anything down. Dalton fretted over her constantly, bringing her water and dry toast, holding her hair back when she was ill, rubbing her back when she ached. He hired a woman from town to come out twice a week to help with the heavier housework, despite Eleanor's protests that she could manage. You are growing our child, he said firmly. That is work enough. Let me take care of everything else. As her belly grew round with their baby, the storms continued to roll through. But now, when Dalton held Eleanor's hand through the thunder, he also rested his other hand on her stomach, feeling their child move and kick beneath his palm. It gave the ritual new meaning, new purpose. He was not just protecting Eleanor anymore, he was protecting their family. In January, when Eleanor was huge and uncomfortable, and convinced she would be pregnant forever, a massive storm blew through that lasted for 2 days straight. The thunder was constant, the lightning so bright it lit up the inside of the house like daylight. Eleanor was exhausted from lack of sleep, from the constant adrenaline of fear, from the sheer effort of being so pregnant during such a stressful time. On the second night, Dalton carried her to their bed and laid down beside her, pulling her back against his chest so they were spooned together. He wrapped his arms around her, one hand splayed across her belly, where he could feel the baby moving, and he just held her. I cannot do this anymore, Eleanor whispered, and he heard the defeat in her voice. I am so tired, Dalton. So tired of being afraid. I know, sweetheart. I know. He pressed his face into her hair. But you are doing it. You are still here, still fighting. That takes incredible strength. I do not feel strong. I feel weak and useless. You are the strongest person I know. He felt the baby kick against his palm and smiled. And our child is going to know that. They are going to know that their mother was brave enough to face her fears day after day, no matter how hard it was. Eleanor started to cry, the quiet tears of someone who has cried so much they have almost run out. Dalton just held her tighter, murmuring words of love and comfort, until finally the storm eased and they both fell into exhausted sleep. 2 weeks later, on a clear, cold morning in mid-February, Eleanor went into labor. Dalton sent for the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, who had delivered half the babies in Fort McDowell, and then he settled in to wait. Labor was long and difficult. Eleanor labored through the day and into the night, and Dalton stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her face with a cool cloth, encouraging her when she said she could not go on. You can do this, he said over and over. You are so strong, Eleanor. Just a little bit more. And then, just before dawn, their son was born. He came into the world wailing, his face red and his fists waving. And when Mrs. Rodriguez placed him in Eleanor's arms, Dalton thought his heart might burst from the sheer force of the love he felt. "He is perfect," Eleanor breathed, tears streaming down her face as she looked at their baby. "Dalton, look at him." "I am looking." Dalton's voice was rough. "He is beautiful, just like his mother." They named him David after Dalton's father, and Thomas after Eleanor's. David Thomas Vance, born on February 14th, 1879, on a ranch in the Arizona Territory under a sky full of stars. The first few weeks with a newborn were exhausting and wonderful and terrifying all at once. David had a healthy set of lungs and was not shy about using them, especially at night. Eleanor was healing from the birth, tired and sore, but radiant with happiness. Dalton was functioning on almost no sleep, but every time he looked at his son, every time he held that tiny warm weight in his arms, he felt nothing but gratitude. The first storm that came after David was born arrived on a warm afternoon in early March. Eleanor was nursing the baby when she heard the distant rumble of thunder, and Dalton saw the old fear flash across her face. But then she looked down at David, at his tiny, perfect face, and something changed in her expression. She took a deep breath, and Dalton saw her deliberately relax her shoulders. "I am all right," she said, meeting his eyes. "I am not going to be afraid anymore. I cannot pass this fear on to him. I will not." Dalton crossed the room and sat beside her on the bed, putting his arm around both of them. "You do not have to be perfect, Eleanor. It is all right to still be afraid." "I know, but I think I am ready to let it go." She leaned into him as the thunder grew louder. "I have you, and I have David, and I have this life we have built together. The storms cannot take that away from me. Nothing can." He kissed her temple. "I am still going to hold your hand anyway." "Good," she said with a small smile, "because I like it when you hold my hand." They sat together, the three of them, while the storm passed overhead. Eleanor did not cry, did not shake, just breathed steadily and held their son close. And when the thunder faded and the rain stopped, she looked at Dalton with something like triumph in her eyes. "I did it," she said. "I was not afraid." "You did it," he agreed, so proud of her he could barely speak. "You faced it down." "We faced it down," she corrected. "Together, like we always do." As David grew from a baby into a toddler, the storms became just another part of life on the ranch. Eleanor still did not love them, still felt her heart rate pick up when she heard thunder. But she did not let the fear control her anymore. She would pick up David and bring him to the window, pointing out the lightning and the rain, teaching him to respect the power of nature without fearing it. Dalton watched his wife become more confident, more at ease with herself, and marveled at the transformation. She had always been strong, he knew that, but now she believed it too. She carried herself differently, spoke with more authority, laughed more freely. Motherhood suited her, and so did the life they had built together. When David was 2, Eleanor told Dalton she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and she barely had any morning sickness at all. Their daughter was born on a cool October evening, arriving so fast that Mrs. Rodriguez almost did not make it in time. They named her Emma Rose, and she had Eleanor's dark eyes and Dalton's smile. With 2 small children, life on the ranch became even busier. Dalton worked from dawn to dusk, tending the cattle, maintaining the property, expanding their herd. Eleanor cared for the children and the house, and together they built something strong and lasting. They added on to the house, building 2 more bedrooms and a larger kitchen. They planted an orchard, apple trees that would take years to mature, but would feed their family for generations. They bought more land, expanding the ranch into something substantial. The storms still came, of course. Arizona would always be a place of dramatic weather, where the sky could go from clear blue to violent black in a matter of minutes. But now, when the thunder rolled, Dalton and Eleanor would gather their children close and sit together as a family, watching nature's fury from the safety of their porch. David, who had grown into a serious, thoughtful boy, would ask questions about the lightning and the clouds. Emma, who was fearless and wild, would laugh at the thunder and beg to be allowed to run out into the rain. And Eleanor would look at Dalton over their heads and smile, secure in the knowledge that they were safe, that they were together, that they had built something beautiful out of fear and love. When David was 8 and Emma was 6, Dalton decided it was time to expand their operation even further. He He had been saving money for years, being careful and frugal, and now he had enough to buy a significant amount of additional land and cattle. It would mean more work, more risk, but it would also mean security for their family, a legacy to pass on to their children. He discussed it with Eleanor one evening after the children were in bed, spreading out maps and papers on the kitchen table. She listened carefully, asking intelligent questions, and then she smiled. "I think you should do it," she said. "I trust your judgment, and I believe in you. We have come so far from where we started. Why stop now?" "It will mean I am away from home more," Dalton warned. "Long days, sometimes overnight trips to move the cattle. I can handle it." Eleanor took his hand. "I am not the scared girl you met in Fort McDowell anymore, Dalton. I am strong now, stronger than I ever knew I could be. And you were the one who taught me that." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. "You taught yourself. I just held your hand while you did it." The expansion was successful beyond their wildest dreams. Within a year, the Vance Ranch was one of the most prosperous in the territory. They hired hands to help with the work, built a bunkhouse for them to sleep in, bought better equipment and stronger horses. Dalton's reputation as a fair boss and a skilled rancher spread, and soon they had men coming from all over looking for work. Eleanor, meanwhile, had started a small business of her own. She still loved sewing, and the women in Fort McDowell and the surrounding ranches had started coming to her for dresses and shirts and alterations. She set up a workroom in one of the spare bedrooms, and in the evenings after the children were asleep, she would sew by lamplight while Dalton did paperwork at the kitchen table. They were building an empire, the two of them, though they never would have called it that. To them, it was just life, just working hard and taking care of each other and creating a future for their children. In the summer of 1887, when David was 9 and Emma was 7, the largest storm anyone could remember hit the Arizona territory. It lasted for 3 days, a relentless assault of wind and rain and lightning that battered everything in its path. Rivers flooded, buildings were damaged, and people huddled in their homes waiting for it to pass. On the first day, Dalton made sure all the animals were secured and brought the ranch hands into the main house so everyone would be safe together. Eleanor cooked for the crowd of them, keeping busy while the storm raged outside. The children were nervous, feeding off the anxiety of the adults, and that night David crept into his parents' room, his face pale. "Papa," he whispered, "I am scared." Dalton, who had been lying awake listening to the storm and worrying about the damage it might be causing, immediately made room for his son in the bed. "Come here, boy." David climbed up and snuggled between his parents. A moment later, they heard small footsteps, and Emma appeared in the doorway. "I heard the thunder," she said, trying to sound brave but failing. "Can I stay with you too?" "Of course, sweetheart." Eleanor lifted the covers, and Emma scrambled in. The four of them lay there in the darkness, listening to the storm. David was pressed against Dalton's side, and Emma was curled up against Eleanor, and Dalton felt a wave of protectiveness so strong it almost hurt. "Tell us the story, Papa," Emma said, "about how you and Mama met." It had become a favorite bedtime story, one Dalton had told 100 times, but never tired of telling. He launched into it now, his voice low and steady in the darkness. "It was a summer day in 1878, he began. "I was riding through Fort McDowell on my way back from selling some cattle, and I heard thunder. I looked up and saw storm clouds gathering over the mountains, and I thought maybe I should find somewhere to wait it out. And that is when I saw your mama standing on the porch of the seamstress shop. And she jumped at the thunder," David added, having heard the story so many times he knew it by heart. "She did, jumped like she had been struck by lightning herself. And I saw that she was scared, really scared, and I thought maybe I could help. So I walked over and I held out my hand, and she took it. And from that moment on, I knew I was going to spend the rest of my life holding her hand through every storm." Eleanor smiled in the darkness, her fingers lacing with his over their children's heads. "And he did," she added. "Every single storm, for all these years, your papa has been right there beside me." "Are you still scared of storms, Mama?" Emma asked. "Not anymore," Eleanor said honestly. "Because I learned that storms pass. They come and they are frightening, and they seem like they will last forever. But they do not. They always pass. And if you have people who love you standing beside you, you can get through anything." "Like we are all together now," David said. "Exactly like that." Dalton hugged his son closer. "We are a family, and families face things together, the good and the bad, the calm and the storms. They fell asleep like that eventually, all four of them piled into one bed, safe and warm, while the storm battered the world outside. And in the morning, when the rain had eased and they ventured outside to assess the damage, they found that the ranch had weathered it well. Some fences were down, and there were tree branches everywhere, but the house was intact, the animals were safe, and they were all together. Over the next few years, David and Emma grew rapidly. David became his father's shadow, following him around the ranch, learning everything he could about running cattle and managing land. Emma, who was as strong-willed as her mother had learned to be, announced that she wanted to learn to sew and started spending her evenings in Eleanor's workroom, practicing stitches and learning patterns. Dalton and Eleanor watched their children grow with a mixture of pride and bittersweet nostalgia. It seemed like just yesterday they had been babies, and now suddenly David was taller than his mother, and Emma was wearing her hair up like a young lady. "They are growing up too fast," Eleanor said one evening, watching David ride out with Dalton to check on the cattle. "They are," Dalton agreed, "but we raise them well. They are good kids." "They are." Eleanor leaned into him. "We did good, did we not? You and me?" "We did great." He kissed her forehead. "We built something real, Eleanor. Something lasting." In 1892, when David was 14 and Emma was 12, Dalton took sick with a fever. It started as what seemed like a simple cold, but it quickly worsened, leaving him bedridden and burning up. Eleanor nursed him frantically, cool cloths and medicine and prayers, while David took over running the ranch, and Emma cared for her father when Eleanor needed to rest. For 3 days, Dalton hovered between life and death, and Eleanor barely left his side. She held his hand constantly, talking to him even when he was delirious and did not seem to know she was there. She told him about everything they had been through together, every storm they had weathered, every moment of joy and struggle. She reminded him of the day they met, of their wedding, of the births of their children. She told him he could not leave her, that she needed him, that their family needed him. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Dalton woke weak and confused but alive, and the first thing he saw was Eleanor's face, pale and exhausted, but smiling through tears. "Welcome back," she whispered. He reached up with a shaking hand and touched her face. "Did you think I would leave you? After all those storms we have been through together?" She laughed, a sound somewhere between joy and relief. "You promised to hold my hand through every storm. You cannot do that if you are gone." "Then I guess I had better stay." He laced his fingers with hers. "I am not ready to let go of your hand yet. Not for a long, long time." It took weeks for Dalton to fully recover, and during that time, Eleanor was reminded of just how strong she had become. She ran the ranch, made decisions about the cattle and the land, managed the hired hands, and kept the household running smoothly. David helped, of course, but it was Eleanor who proved that she could do anything she set her mind to. When Dalton was finally well enough to get out of bed and move around, he found the ranch running as smoothly as ever. He stood in the doorway of the barn, watching Eleanor direct the hands on where to store the hay they had just brought in, and he felt a surge of love so powerful it took his breath away. She saw him watching and came over, concern on her face. "You should be resting." "I have been resting for weeks. I needed to see you in action." He took her hand, the gesture as natural as breathing after all these years. "You are amazing, Eleanor Vance. Have I told you that lately?" She smiled. "You have, but I never get tired of hearing it." "Good, because I plan to keep saying it for the rest of our lives." Time moved on, as it always does. David grew into a man, strong and capable like his father, kind and thoughtful like his mother. Emma grew into a woman, beautiful and fierce, with a talent for sewing that rivaled Eleanor's own. They both had suitors, though David was shy about it, and Emma was picky, declaring that she would not settle for anyone who was not as good a man as her father. "That is a high bar to set," Dalton said when she told him this. "I know," Emma kissed his cheek, "but I learned from the best. I learned what real love looks like, watching you and Mama all these years." In 1895, David married a rancher's daughter named Sarah, a sweet-natured girl with a practical head on her shoulders. They built a house on the edge of the Vance property, and David continued working the ranch with his father. A year later, they made Dalton and Eleanor grandparents with the birth of a baby boy they named Jacob. Emma waited longer, but in 1898 she met a young man who had come to Fort McDowell to start a freight business. His name was Michael, and he courted Emma with patience and determination, winning her over slowly but surely. They were married in the summer of 1899, and Emma moved to town to be with him, though she visited the ranch often. Dalton and Eleanor found themselves alone again, their children grown and starting families of their own. The ranch was quieter now, though they still had the hired hands and plenty of work to keep them busy. But in the evenings they would sit on the porch like they had done for more than 20 years, watching the sun set over the desert and holding hands in comfortable silence. "Do you ever think about that first day?" Eleanor asked one evening, "when you saw me jump at the thunder?" "All the time," Dalton said. "I think about how close I came to just riding on past. I could have missed you completely, could have gone my whole life without knowing you existed. But you did not ride past." Eleanor squeezed his hand. "You stopped. You helped. You stayed. Best decision I ever made." He turned to look at her, this woman he had loved for more than 2 decades, and saw that she was just as beautiful now as she had been that day on the porch. Maybe more so, because now he knew every line on her face, every scar and imperfection, and loved her more deeply because of them. "I used to be so afraid," Eleanor said softly. "Afraid of storms, afraid of life, afraid of being hurt. And you taught me that I did not have to be afraid, that even when the thunder came, I could face it, because I was not alone." "You were never alone," Dalton said, "not from the moment I held out my hand to you." A rumble of thunder sounded in the distance, and they both looked up to see storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Eleanor did not tense, did not freeze. She just smiled and settled more comfortably into her chair, her hand still in Dalton's. "Here comes another one," she said. "Here comes another one," he agreed. "Should we go inside?" "Not yet." Eleanor looked at him, her dark eyes warm with love. "Let us sit here for a while longer, together." So they did. They sat on the porch of the ranch they had built together, holding hands the way they had done through countless storms over countless years, and watched the thunder roll across the desert. The lightning flashed brilliant white against the darkening sky, and the rain came down in sheets, washing the dust from the air and leaving everything smelling clean and new. And through it all, Dalton Vance held Eleanor Vance's hand, just like he had promised he would, just like he had done every single storm since the day they met. Because that was what love looked like, he had learned. Love was holding someone's hand through the thunder. Love was being the steady presence when everything else was chaos. Love was choosing every single day to stand beside someone and face whatever came together. The years continued to pass, gentle and swift. Dalton and Eleanor grew older, their hair turning silver, their faces weathering like the land around them, but their love never dimmed. If anything, it grew stronger, deeper, rooted more firmly with each passing season. David and Sarah gave them 3 more grandchildren, 2 girls and another boy. Emma and Michael had twin daughters who were the spitting image of their mother. The ranch house that had once seemed too big with just 2 children now felt full and alive again when the grandchildren came to visit, their laughter echoing off the adobe walls. Dalton taught his grandsons to ride and rope, the same way he had taught David. Eleanor taught her granddaughters to sew, passing on skills and stories. And when storms came, which they still did with regularity, the whole family would gather together to watch, the children asking questions about the lightning, while Dalton and Eleanor held hands and smiled at each other with the quiet contentment of people who had weathered every storm life could throw at them. In 1903, when they had been married for 25 years, David and Emma threw them an anniversary party. Half the town came, along with neighboring ranchers and their families. There was food and music and dancing, and at the end of the evening, when the guests had left and the family was sitting around the big table, Emma raised her glass. "To Papa and Mama," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Who taught us what real love looks like? Who showed us that storms pass and families endure? Who built something beautiful out of nothing but hard work and devotion? Thank you for everything you have given us." Everyone drank to that, and Eleanor found herself crying, happy tears that she did not bother to wipe away. Dalton put his arm around her and pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "Thank you," he whispered, just for her. "For taking my hand that day, for trusting me, for building this life with me." "Thank you for stopping," she whispered back, "for seeing me, for loving me through every storm." As they moved into their 60s, Dalton and Eleanor began to slow down. They handed over more of the ranch operations to David, content to take a step back and enjoy the fruits of their decades of labor. They spent their days doing the things they loved, riding out to check on the cattle together, working in the orchard, sitting on the porch and watching the grandchildren play. The storms still came, as inevitable as sunrise, but now they were a comfort rather than a source of fear, a reminder of how far they had come, how much they had overcome. Every time the thunder rolled, Eleanor would reach for Dalton's hand and he would take it without hesitation, their fingers fitting together like they were made for exactly that purpose. In the spring of 1908, as they were sitting on the porch watching a storm approach, Eleanor turned to Dalton with a serious expression. "I want you to know something," she said. "What is that, sweetheart?" "I am not afraid anymore. Not of storms, not of life, not of death when it comes. Because I know that whatever happens, we have had this. We have had 30 years of love and partnership and joy. We have built a family and a legacy. We have faced every storm together, and that is more than most people ever get." Dalton felt his throat tighten. "We have been blessed," he agreed, "more than I ever dared to hope for." "I love you, Dalton Vance." Eleanor squeezed his hand. "I have loved you from that very first day, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "I love you too, Eleanor Vance." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, the very best thing." The storm broke over them then, thunder and lightning and rain, but they did not move. They just sat there together, holding hands the way they always had, the way they always would. Two people who had found each other in the chaos and built something strong enough to withstand anything. As the years rolled on into 1910 and beyond, Dalton and Eleanor became the matriarch and patriarch of a sprawling family. They had 5 grandchildren and, eventually, great-grandchildren began to arrive. The ranch that Dalton had built with his own 2 hands became a gathering place for generations, a symbol of what could be accomplished with hard work and love. They grew old together gracefully, their bodies slowing, but their spirits remaining strong. They still took walks together every evening, still sat on the porch and watched the storms, still held hands like they were young lovers instead of an old married couple. On a warm evening in June of 1913, exactly 35 years after the day they met, another storm rolled across the Arizona desert. Dalton and Eleanor were in their usual spots on the porch, gray-haired and weathered, but still very much in love. The thunder started low and distant, and as always, Eleanor reached for Dalton's hand. He took it, his grip still strong despite his 70 years. "Here we go again," he said with a smile. "Here we go again," Eleanor agreed, smiling back. They watched the storm approach together, this couple who had faced so many storms over so many years. The lightning danced across the sky, and the thunder rolled like drums, and the rain came down in silver sheets. And through it all, Dalton held Eleanor's hand, just like he had promised, just like he had done every single time, because that was their story. Not a story of a woman who was broken and a man who fixed her, but a story of 2 people who found each other and chose every single day to face life together. A story of holding hands through the thunder, of being each other's shelter in the storm, of building something beautiful and lasting out of love and commitment and unwavering devotion. As the storm moved on and the stars began to emerge in the clearing sky, Eleanor rested her head on Dalton's shoulder with a contented sigh. "What a life we have had," she murmured. "What a life," he agreed, kissing her silver hair. "And it is not over yet." "No," she said, smiling in the darkness. "Not yet." They sat there together as the night deepened around them, 2 souls intertwined so completely that they could not remember a time when they had been separate. The desert was quiet now, except for the drip of water from the eaves and the distant call of a coyote. In the house behind them, they could hear David and Sarah putting the children to bed, the sounds of family and love and continuity. Dalton looked up at the stars, bright and endless in the clear sky after the storm. He thought about that day 35 years ago, when he had seen a frightened woman jump at thunder and made the split-second decision to help her. He thought about all the storms they had faced together since then, both literal and metaphorical. He thought about the life they had built, the children they had raised, the love they had nurtured through decades of joy and struggle. And he thought that if he had it all to do over again, he would not change a single thing. Every moment, every storm, every challenge had been worth it to have this woman by his side, to build this family, to create this legacy. "Eleanor," he said softly. "Yes, my love? Thank you for jumping at that thunder all those years ago. Thank you for letting me hold your hand." She lifted her head to look at him, and in the starlight he could see tears glistening in her eyes. "Thank you for seeing me," she said, "for truly seeing me, fear and all, and loving me anyway. Thank you for teaching me that I was stronger than I knew. Thank you for every storm you held my hand through. Thank you for this beautiful life." He cupped her face in his weathered hands and kissed her, tender and sweet, a kiss that held 35 years of love and devotion. When they pulled apart, she was smiling through her tears. "I love you, Dalton Vance, today and always." "I love you too, Eleanor Vance, today and always." They settled back into comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. Somewhere in the distance, more thunder rumbled, another storm building on the horizon. But they were not afraid. They had faced too many storms together to be afraid of one more. And when that storm came, as it inevitably would, Dalton would hold Eleanor's hand through it, just like he always had. Because that was what love meant. That was what forever looked like. Two people facing the thunder together, holding on tight, and never letting go. The story of Dalton and Eleanor Vance became a legend in Fort McDowell, passed down through generations. People would point to the ranch and tell their children about the cowboy who had seen a woman jump at thunder and had held her hand through every storm for the rest of their lives. They would talk about the love that had built an empire, about the partnership that had weathered every challenge, about the devotion that had never wavered. And on stormy nights when the thunder rolled across the Arizona desert, the descendants of Dalton and Eleanor would gather together, just like their ancestors had taught them. They would hold hands and watch the lightning, and they would remember the lesson that had been passed down through the generations, that love is not about grand gestures or perfect moments, but about showing up day after day, storm after storm, and choosing to hold someone's hand through whatever comes. Dalton and Eleanor lived to see their golden anniversary in 1923, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who bore witness to what they had built together. They were old then, their bodies frail, but their love was as strong as ever. And on the evening of their 50th anniversary, when a summer storm rolled through and the thunder cracked overhead, Dalton reached for Eleanor's hand one more time. She took it without hesitation, their fingers intertwining with the ease of 50 years of practice. They sat together on the porch of the home they had shared for half a century, holding hands as the storm raged and eventually passed, leaving behind clean air and a brilliant sunset. 50 years, Eleanor said wonderingly. 50 years of storms and sunsets. And I would do it all again, Dalton said. Every single storm, every single moment, just to end up right here with you. Me too, she said, squeezing his hand. Me too, my love. They watched the sun sink below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson and purple. And as the first stars began to appear, Dalton Vance held Eleanor Vance's hand and thought that this, right here, was what heaven looked like. Not some distant promise of paradise, but this moment, this woman, this life they had built together one storm at a time. That was their happy ending. Not a fairy tale conclusion where everything was perfect and nothing ever went wrong, but a real ending, an earned ending, built on decades of choosing each other, supporting each other, loving each other through every storm that came their way. They had started with a moment of fear and an offered hand, and they had turned it into a lifetime of love and partnership and unwavering devotion. And when their time finally came, as it comes for everyone, they went together peacefully in their sleep, still holding hands after more than 50 years of marriage. Their children and grandchildren mourned, but they also celebrated, because Dalton and Eleanor had given them the greatest gift imaginable, an example of what true love looked like, a legacy of strength and devotion, and the knowledge that, with the right person by your side, you could weather any storm. The ranch continued on, passed down through the generations, a testament to what Dalton and Eleanor had built together. And on stormy nights, when the thunder rolled across the Arizona desert, the family would gather on that same porch and hold hands, remembering the cowboy who had seen a woman jump at thunder and had held her hand through every single storm for the rest of their lives. Because that was what love was. That was what forever meant. And that was the legacy Dalton and Eleanor Vance left behind. A legacy that would endure as long as the thunder rolled and the rain fell on the Arizona desert they had called home.